Hey everyone, so today's video presentation is going to be by Professor Syed Mohammad Marandi. He is a professor at the University of Tehran in English literature, and he is also an expert on American studies and post-colonial literature. I was recently watching this presentation by him, this talk, and I found it so interesting and thought-provoking that I wanted to share with you guys. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy the video, watch it in its entirety. I'm the Millennial Revolt. Thank you guys so much for watching, and you have a wonderful day. Bye.
Conflict Center for inviting me. It's really a wonderful occasion for me to visit this city and this country, and I'm very grateful that you thought of me as being useful to this panel. It's very difficult for me to continue after the first two speakers, but I'll sort of use themes that both touched upon Professor Jean when he spoke about basically understanding the problem, I think, and then Alistair Crook when he spoke about the narrative building. I'll be touching upon basically what I'll be trying to do is combine these two themes, although I won't be speaking about naked women. I think one of the important points that have to be kept in mind is the whole construct of knowledge when it comes to negotiating or dialogue. And I think one of the problems is that we often think that or sometimes think that the problem is to find common ground. And we assume that there is no common ground when there is severe conflict. Whereas in fact, often there may be common ground, but there is not an intention on one side or both sides to use that common ground. And when hegemony is involved, or hierarchy of civilization or culture or hierarchy of power is involved, it's very difficult to force the side that has the upper hand to recognize that they have to sort of come down and to see the other side as an equal. Touching upon the example that Alistair gave, when the Brazilian president and the Turkish prime minister at that time, Mr. Erdogan, came to Iran, they both had a letter from Obama stating the conditions under which he will accept a solution. This, I think, was in 2010, if I'm not mistaken about dates, because the Iranian calendar is different, so I'm always confusing these things. When they came to Iran, they negotiated a deal. The Iranians accepted what the Turks and the Brazilians and the Iranian delegation came up with. And the Iranians thought the nuclear issue was solved. Well, they didn't think so. They knew that this would not be solved. But it should have been solved. They had, after all, these two presidents, this president, prime minister, had a letter from the president of the United States who was the source of the problem from the Iranian perspective. But, of course, as expected, as soon as the deal was signed, the Americans said it was completely unacceptable. And on, I think, the subsequent day, the UN Security Council passed a new resolution. Brazil and Turkey at that time were both non-permanent members of the Council. They did not vote for it, but they were basically sidelined. So is the issue, or was the issue, common ground? No, I think Obama miscalculated. He thought that he would be able to present this letter so that he could push for sanctions when the Iranians don't accept, and make Iranians suffer. And of course, Obama killed many Iranians when the severe sanctions that were imposed caused a huge disruption in importing medicine. Many cancer patients died as a result. But this is how US policy works. Just like in Yemen, when the country is blockaded and millions of people are starving, but you don't hear of this in the BBC or CNN or other media outlets. Very rare, because they're not of value, because of the narrative is as such that it's not in their interest to look that way. So what are some of the narratives that or the binaries that we see that come up in this narrative? And I'm obviously giving an Iranian perspective, and not everyone here has to agree with it. But if there are going to be talks and negotiations and ultimately solutions, then it has to be recognized that there's more than one side of the problem. When just this morning I was getting ready to come downstairs, I turned on the TV and there was the BBC. And of course, Iskute was big, and how ordinary people are suffering in Iskute. But the same sort of bombing, if not more severe, happened in Raqqa by the Americans. But you did not see that sort of narrative building in the media. In Aleppo, if you recall, when the Russian Air Force was bombing the militants, and both in Iskute and in Aleppo, Al-Qaeda, as it were, are embedded. You know, the same group that the United States began this whole disaster because of 9/11, the war on terror began, and all these subsequent catastrophes were because of Al-Qaeda attacking New York. So in Iskute and in Aleppo, we had Al-Qaeda. So in Aleppo too, the Russians were murderers and killers, and every day the last hospital was bombed. I think we had 20 times, 15 or 20 times someone added them up, that the term "the last hospital" was used during what was happening in Aleppo. But when the Americans were bombing Mosul in northern Iraq, that was not the narrative that you see in the media. I've been to both Mosul and Aleppo, by the way, and on both occasions I went soon after the bombing, and it was similar, the destruction. So again, a lot has to do with narrative buildings. And why am I giving these examples? Because you have to see how the other side, both sides, are viewing and presenting. And the way in which the Western media, the sheer power of the Western media and Western think tanks, is not only that they're able to convince their own societies, because other news outlets across the world do not have their capabilities or their finances. They get their news from the Western media. So even in Iran, for example, if we are going to learn about Russia, there's more information coming from Western outlets than there are from any other. So we are going to learn about Russia, about Brazil, about Africa, more from Western sources that we're going to learn from indigenous sources. And this is, of course, true with Iran as well. So these binaries, for me, are highly questionable. Another binary is Shia-Sunni. And this is a key binary that has been used over the last few years, over the last few decades, but in particular over the last few years. Again, the Iranians don't see it that way. Because first of all, one of the real reason, the ultimate reason why Iran is demonized in the West is because it's actually supporting Sunnis. And that is Hamas, the Islamic Jihad, Fatah, and other Palestinian movements to different degrees. These are all Sunni groups. And most of the difficulty that Iran faces is as a result. So then we have, of course, another binary, and that is Jewish, Muslim, Semitic, anti-Semitic. Regardless of the fact that the Palestinian people are Semites, but for Iran's policy towards Israel is identical to Iran's policy towards apartheid South Africa. In fact, Iran's non-recognition of Israel is exactly and identical to Iran's non-recognition of apartheid as South Africa. Iran did not recognize apartheid South Africa as morally legitimate, and they have the same policy towards Israel. If apartheid in Israel is removed, problem solved. That's the Iranian perspective. But of course, the mistranslation, intentional, of Iranian leaders wiping Israel, what was it, off the map or whatever, or slaughter, mass slaughter, and so on and so forth. This is the narrative that is built on Iran. And Iran is therefore scapegoated by Israel and the United States in order to justify all sorts of policies, whether it's the subjugation of the Palestinian people or Israel's constant aggression against Syria, illegal against international law. But when you're able to demonize the other side, the importance of international law sort of, becomes vague. This is almost identical to what happened in South Africa, because the ANC, which was the dominant opposition movement, was a communist party according to the apartheid ruling regime. And Nelson Mandela was the head of a communist and the head of this organization. So he was a communist linked to the Soviet Union, and in much of the Western world, he was a terrorist. The United States passed laws against the ANC, and Nelson Mandela as the head of the ANC. So when Nelson Mandela was freed, he was a terrorist. When he became president of South Africa, he was still a terrorist. And when he wanted to go to the United States to speak at the General Assembly, he was still a terrorist. And he had to get special permission from the US government to enter the United States because he was a terrorist. And only after his presidency was over did the law change in the United States. It was law. So by constructing or by building a narrative about your adversary, you legitimize almost anything. So during the Iran-Iraq War, Iran was evil. Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons that were provided to him by European Union countries today, EEC countries back then, provided by the British, the Germans, Belgium, and to a lesser extent France. He used them against the Kurds. He used them against Iranian civilians. He used them against Iranian combatants. I personally survived 2 chemical attacks. Others didn't. Yet none of this was in the Western media. Even though the BBC, well, back then it wasn't CNN, ABC, NBC, CBS, the main channels, they were news channels. Their reporters were brought to Iran. The UN Security Council did not condemn Saddam Hussein. Massive numbers of people were massacred. In Halabja alone, 5,000 people were killed. When did the Western media start talking about Saddam Hussein and chemical weapons? When he entered Kuwait. When he entered Kuwait, the US president at the time, George Bush, came on television and said, this monster kills his own people and kills the people in neighboring countries. And then the media started to reframe the whole narrative. So the most monstrous of weapons can be used, and human life is of no value because of the narrative. And then the same weapon, arguably it's debatable who used the chemical weapons in Syria, and we could go over that in detail later on. Who had a vested interest in using these chemical weapons? What happened on the 2 occasions that are well remembered? There are good articles written by an MIT professor. In any case, we could go over that later on. But suddenly, chemical weapons becomes all important, and of course, it's absolutely clear who, according to the West, who used them. There's no need for an investigation because they are the ones who build the narratives. They are credible. Anyone else is not credible. If the Russians say it's that the Syrian government do it. It's not credible because the Russians are liars. It's in their DNA. As Wendy Sherman once spoke about Iranians, the Deputy U.S. Secretary of State, she said the dishonesty is in their DNA. And she was the U.S. Undersecretary of State under President Obama. So in Syria, this narrative, which was used and continues to be used, builds it up upon a Shia-Sunni frame. Its Shia-Sunni frame is used, whereas in reality, what we have is Wahhabism, largely. And this was almost how it was from the start. Of course, the Syrian government did many wrong things, but the number of people who were killed in Syria during the first few months on the streets were far less than the number of people who were killed in Cairo on the streets. In one day in Cairo during the coup or the revolution, depending on whose side you're on, in 2013, I think it was August 11th, I'm not sure, between 1,000 and 5,000 people were killed when the Muslim Brotherhood were protesting in the squares. You know, whether it's, you know, I don't care whose side one is on, whether it's a coup or a revolution or a counter-revolution. The government says less than 1,000 people in one day. But no one tried to undermine the system. But we know that in Syria, international law from the beginning was being violated. We know from the Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012, which has been partially released because of Judicial Watch, which is a conservative organization. They because of Libya, they were able to bring out this information. But what came out of this document, and the Defense Intelligence Agency of the United States is the most important military intelligence agency in the world. It has almost 20,000 people working for it. They stated in 2012 that almost from the very beginning, the groups in Syria that had the upper hand were the extremists. And that neighboring regional countries like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and others, that they were helping these extremists to build a Salafist state between Syria and Iraq. And the head of that organization at the time, General Flynn, who is now in trouble, on Al Jazeera, he said that the United States took a willful decision to support the policies of its regional allies. What sort of regime was created between Syria and Iraq? It was ISIS. But if you speak to an American and you say that the United States was involved in the rise of ISIS, they would look at you with contempt and outrage because our government does not do that sort of thing. You know, we don't do Vietnam, we don't do Nicaragua, we don't do Contra rebels, we don't do these things. But it is expected of Iranians or Russians to do these things because it's in our DNA. That's how the narrative works. So, or for example, when we're talking about Iraq, Saddam Hussein was created. How much time do I have left? Sorry. Am I finished? I talk too much. You know, I'm a teacher. When I stop is when students start making noise. They start, you know, closing their books really out, you know, loudly to tell me that, you know, move on, get on with life. But I'll just give this one final example, and that is, look at the example of Iraq. The United States helped create Saddam Hussein. You all know the story. I don't want to get into it. They helped destroy Saddam. They didn't help destroy. They destroyed Saddam Hussein, and they destroyed Iraq in the process, in stages, through sanctions. 1 million people were killed. The Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State of the United States, when at a time when 500,000 people had died of the sanctions, she said that it was worth it in an interview. Just like when Clinton went to Libya, and she said, "We came, we saw, and he died," like Caesar. But In Iraq, in the case of Iraq, when Iran became a part of the equation, because the new order in Iraq that came about had many people in it that were friendly, now the talk in the West is, how do we roll back Iran? As if Iran is Nazi Germany and we've gone into Iraq. But who wants to roll Iran back? It's the United States and its allies who are across the Atlantic somewhere. It's sort of like saying we should roll the French back from Spain. Is Iran occupying Iraq? No, it has good relations with key figures and key players in the country. But Iran has to be rolled back. In other words, Iran is a country that has no legitimacy. It has no legitimate role. Why? Because it is somehow a threat. It is abnormal. Therefore, this whole narrative can be easily justified and made meaningful. But no one talks about rolling back the United States. No one talks about rolling back US allies. No one talks about rolling back Saudi Arabia and its Wahhabi groups. Because this rolling back the word is loaded. It doesn't fit with the United States. It can be used for Iran because the narrative Iran has been constructed as such to make it identical to previous outrages that history has provided with humanity. Thank you very much.